So I have the unenviable task of speaking after John and Alan and sort of trying to bring this back around to what does this mean for us as actuaries. And let's start off by sort of observing that emerging risks isn't a new thing. Humankind, through its development, has always created new risks. And since the end of the 18th century, insurance has played a vital role in supporting human development and the development of industry and trade by insuring those risks. And that's where we as actuaries and risk professionals come into the picture. So what I thought I would do in my little section is to first of all look back at the new risks that emerged over my 30-year career and see, well, what can we learn from that? Think a little bit about some future risks and then bring it back to, well, how do we think about this differently as actuaries? And sorry, I will apologise that my examples are going to be a little GI-centric, but I think that the principles apply more broadly across the industries where we work. So last 30 years, I've just pulled out 4 examples of risks that emerged: asbestos, pandemics, GFC, terrorism. I'm not going to talk about all of them in detail. Asbestos, I think I'll talk about that one. So asbestos was mined from the end of the 19th century, and in the 1940s, the Wittenoom mine in WA started operation. And even at that time, there were studies that were linking asbestos dust with deaths. And there were safe asbestos dust levels, and Wittenoom always operated at many multiples over those safe levels, which actually themselves weren't safe. Through the 50s and 60s, there were various medical papers and research papers linking asbestos dust to deaths and naming a new disease, mesothelioma. And in 1966, Wittenoom closed for economic reasons, not health reasons. And asbestos continued to be used in the construction industry widely in Australia and around the world. And it wasn't until 1978 that there was regulations around the use of asbestos, and not until, I didn't realise this until I was researching it for this, in 2003 there was actually an Australia-wide ban on the use of materials containing asbestos. So from an insurance perspective, we didn't realise, or we came to realise that asbestos was a problem in the mid-1980s. To late 80s, when there were the first successful common law claims. At that stage, then the main response was for insurance companies to exclude asbestos from policies, but of course that was only a go-forward position. That didn't help the past situation, and the actuarial role in this case was trying to quantify the extent of that past problem, and we had to work with epidemiologists to develop new methods, new approaches, linking exposure to disease progression, onset, and unfortunately death. Mesothelioma always results in death. So what did we learn? So a few things, and linking back to what John had to say, that we have to think like bad people. Asbestos was known to be dangerous. It was known to be dangerous for a long time before it was banned. And it took a long time for businesses and for governments to act. And by that stage, and I think if we'd have got the numbers right at the start of asbestos, we would have sent a number of insurance companies insolvent. Terrorism and GFC, pandemics. I think I'll talk about pandemics. So we've always had pandemics. We had the Black Death in the 14th century, Spanish flu in 1918. There was avian flu in Hong Kong in 1997. But it wasn't until SARS in 2003 spread to 4 countries that we began to think about the insurability or the insurance implications of global pandemics. So what did we do? Well, we did what we often do, is we went in and we put exclusions on insurance policies, particularly travel insurance. And in property insurance, there's a thing called business interruption, which was normally linked to physical damage to a property. But because of Legionnaire's disease, an extension for infectious diseases had been put in sometime probably in the 80s or 90s. I see Greg Taylor there, who knows all this history far better than I do. So this infectious disease clause was in. So people put an exclusion in from the infectious disease. However, when COVID came along, we found that they weren't very well worded. We had not identified that the legislation had changed in all cases, and the wording could be interpreted in different ways. And so why did it take SARS for us to recognise the risk, and why did it take COVID for us to get serious enough to ensure that exclusions were properly worded? So new risks for the future. So we've already talked about cyber. I'm going to talk about connectivity. So one of the things that's different in the future than in the past is that we're a lot more connected and a lot more reliant on technology than we were in the past. In 1859, there was a severe solar storm called the Carrington event that knocked out telegraph communications pretty badly. If that event happened today, it would take out electrical grids, satellite communications, and losses would be in the trillions of dollars. There'd be very long disruptions to services. And yet, what have we done to mitigate that risk? So, things to think about for us as actuaries. First of all, we need to realise that our models are going to be wrong. Our models often rely on past data. By their nature, new risks are either new or their existing risks are accelerating very fast, and the past isn't going to tell us about the future. You can't pick the risk. So we've talked about cyber and cyber hacks impacting systems, but it could be a weather event or a severe weather event that we haven't thought about that affects systems. So we have to look at scenarios, as John talked about, and we have to sort of understand how those scenarios will affect systems. And what we have to be looking for is the frailties, what might go wrong. COVID obviously exposed our huge dependency on supply chains. Climate change highlights issues of food security. We need to be part of multidisciplinary teams. We're only actuaries, and we only think and have experience in a certain way. So we need to work with others. We need to work with security experts if we're looking at cyber, medical experts if we're looking at disease. We need to have diverse thinking, different types of thinking, and we need to have challenging thinking. In those past examples I gave you, they were all risks that people knew about, but nothing was done to mitigate the risk because no one imagined it would be as bad as the actual outcome was. It was only when the claims started coming in. We are much more connected, and therefore, as actuaries, we often talk about fat tails, but the tails are getting fatter because of the level of connectivity and interdependence that we have. Our systems are also complex, and we often only understand quite a narrow part of the system. Again, that leads us to having to work with teams and groups of people who can understand the full systems. And finally, what can we do when we identify emerging risks? Well, we need to call out concerns and risks if we feel that it's being underappreciated to help to try and limit the risk, make it manageable, make it something that is insurable within the financial capacity of insurance companies. And we also can then sometimes also help with alternative risk transfer solutions. So terrorism's an example of that. Well, after September 11, terrorism exclusions came in. Actuaries helped design terrorism pools set up by governments, and gradually commercial insurance has come back into those markets. So I'm going to leave it at that. I'm looking forward to a really lively discussion and hopefully lots of talk about space and fiction.